a couple of people wrote in also last week questions having to do with, because we were talking about letting go of boundaries, the kind of boundaries that we erect to separate ourselves from each other. And of course, people wrote in some questions about, is there a place for healthy boundaries? And I talked very briefly last week about the necessity for healthy boundaries to have a sense of sort of your own autonomy. And with that, there is the wise and centered and grounded aspect of our being has a sense of appropriate boundaries, because to be an open and loving presence in the world, it's not to be a doormat for anybody to walk over that wants to. It doesn't mean that you have to just sit and take anything that comes at you. That would be a kind of love without wisdom. That's why last week I talked a lot about the necessity to also have a kind of clarity, a kind of wisdom, because this kind of, the correct usage of boundaries comes from a deep sense of clarity and sort of personal autonomy that comes from that. I'm not going to get into a whole lot about, the correct sense of psychological boundaries. I want to kind of get in underneath that, even, like I said, to the spirit of things. But I hope it's sufficient to say, at least, that there is a place for wise boundaries. You ever notice that really clear, mature beings, and especially enlightened beings, they're not doormats for anybody. There is a sense of autonomy. There is a sense of a natural sense of boundaries without being barricaded, right? So what I'm really looking at here is you can have wise and appropriate boundaries, but at the same time, that doesn't mean you need to shut your mind down or shut your heart off. We can have wise and appropriate boundaries and also be very open and be very loving, and hopefully also be coming from the wisdom that can often come from a very deep well of silence and presence within you, right? So the boundaries that I was talking about last week were the kind of boundaries where you close the heart off. We don't have to close the heart off, really, in order to have a sense of appropriate boundaries, appropriate sense of what's right and not so right for that situation, for that circumstance, or that person. So I just wanted to make a clarification so nobody misunderstood and thought that to let go of the boundaries that surround the heart and the mind, that we protect our idea of ourself behind. These boundaries are unnecessary. These are like psychological walls where we're defending our idea of ourself. We are defending our opinions and our viewpoints. These kind of boundaries are completely unnecessary. These just cut us off from one another. So it's really an important part of this, bringing love and compassion into action. We really need to see those thought forms, those beliefs and those personal opinions that we may have, that sort of judgmentalism that a lot of minds have, that really create inappropriate boundaries, unnecessary boundaries. They become walls that we hide behind. We can have a fortress of ideas and judgments that sustain the separate self. So these are really important to be able to look at in a deep way and start to acknowledge. And you'll feel it within yourself. You'll feel when your boundaries come up. There's a certain sort of emotional sense that arises, the feeling of defensiveness. Everybody knows what it's like to feel defensive. Somebody starts to challenge your point of view, or they challenge something you said, and the ego mind can so easily become defensive, and it starts to go into a protective mode, or sometimes the ego will get even more aggressive, right? And so it's really important to see when you start to feel that, when a sense of defensiveness starts arising. I mean, at the deepest level, what am I defending? Who am I defending, really? And so often when you really look in a deep way, you can see that you're defending essentially an idea, a point of view. You know, our points of views don't really need to be defended. They can be stated. We can be very honest and forthcoming in the way we see something. But defensiveness is an egoic trait, right? It's what sustains the feeling of separateness. So I like this to be